expertise in terms of housing policy, in terms of the reality of homelessness in our capital city, and also first-hand experience of how our dysfunctional housing system affects people's lives. I think the voices that we should be hearing from most often in this debate are those we tend to hear from least, and we hope to try and rectify that today. So our first speaker is Jessica Freed, an actor by profession who has her own story to tell on how the housing system no longer actually works for the majority of our people. Jessica. You're muted, Jessica. Muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, McDara. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank Frank Connolly of SIPTU for inviting me to speak today. I wish it was under better circumstances. I'm actually in the middle of the crisis we're talking about here today. After 15 years in my last rental place, I was evicted. I've been officially homeless for 2.5 months. I've only managed to stay out of emergency accommodation because I've been couch surfing among various kind friends. And anybody who thinks that couch surfing is fun in middle age, I can assure you that it isn't. My parents are gone. There's no family home to go to in an emergency. I've been on the housing list for nearly 10 years. I'm still years away from being housed. There is absolutely nowhere to go. I've known this was coming down the track for about a year. I've been looking. I've seen maybe 3 places. You don't even get answers to queries about properties. There's only a handful, and there are hundreds of people chasing each ad. Most of these places, you wouldn't put a dog into them. And even places that are reasonably okay, they're not suitable. They're not suitable for making a home in. They're suitable for maybe students or young workers who are moving on. I have an excellent reference from a landlord. I haven't had an opportunity to even show it to anybody. That's how little response you get. My stuff is in storage. I'm paying for that. Don't know when I'm going to be able to bring that out. In the medium term, there's not even any hope for me being housed. That's how bad it is. Now, I've been a professional actor since the late 80s, and I've always rented because as a freelancer, mortgages were closed to me. Doesn't matter how religiously you paid rent, doesn't mean anything to a bank. But in the 80s and 90s, you could rent, you could move around. A lot of the places were kippy, but you could live without going into debt. You could manage on a low income. If you were kicked out of one place or you had to leave it, you found another place. And that all changed in the late 90s, 2000s. Rents just doubled overnight. The boom was coming. Every Tom, Dick and Harry was encouraged to go out and buy a second property. Even if they couldn't afford it, all they had to provide was a deposit. The banks did the rest. So people like me ended up basically paying other people's mortgages for them, because you were basically paying the guts of somebody's mortgage, but you couldn't access the mechanism for having your own mortgage to provide your own security. And this was never going to end well. I knew this at the time. Now, the last place I moved to was in 2005. And even though I managed to be there for 14 years, a little over 14 years, you couldn't, it's not secure. Every year you could have to leave it. You could be kicked out of it. Well, that happened. Finally, that happened last year. I had a long lead in because I had a lot of notice. Then the pandemic hit, the evictions were paused, and now I'm where I am. Okay, now this to me is a human rights issue. It's not, housing isn't something you earn or you deserve the right to. There's responsibilities that come with it. You have to pay your rent, you don't wreck the place, you're a good neighbor. But you are entitled to a roof over your head, no matter what your background or where you come from, or whether you've made the right decisions in life. And I don't think that the general public has fully grasped that. Once property became a means of making money, houses were no longer homes, they were assets. And people still think that way. And people cling on to their outdated stereotypes of people who rent, people who are homeless, sort of lazy, feckless, dysfunctional people who all want something for nothing, all on the backs of the hardworking taxpayer. And most people won't admit that they think that's way, but a lot of people do. And it's easier to believe that than to believe that the system is at fault. And it's a system that they benefited from. And even well-meaning people, it's not that they don't care. It's they can't get their heads around it. They can't bring themselves to see it as a necessity. And this is really without a public consciousness raising campaign. And that's why I'm so delighted that Raise the Roof exists and has brought together so many different people from different disciplines. Without targeting the public, not a lot is going to change. You can target governments all you like, but people vote governments in. They vote the governments in that will protect their interest and protect their privilege. And by privilege, I don't mean money. I don't mean unearned privilege. I mean privilege of access and privilege of choice. And that's really my focus, is to get that out there. And it's like, it's any problem that we've had in the past in this country, institutional abuse, racism, homophobia, climate destruction. No, it was not a topic of conversation. People had to come out and make us listen to that for anything to change. It's not enough for people to say, well, I'm not involved in that. I don't believe in that, or it's all dreadful. It's that kind of passivity just doesn't cut it anymore. And I think that if there's any focus on it, getting that message across is the most important thing to me, whatever happens. And I'm conscious that I'm one of the lucky ones, in that I'm physically fit and well, I'm mentally fit and well, I've got good friends, I'm able to speak for myself. I can only imagine what this is like for people even more vulnerable, and that has to change. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that was a very stark tale of our times, and I think you're absolutely correct to characterize this as a human rights issue, because it is, and it's probably the issue of our society that's been dominating our society, largely unspoken, for the last 5 to 10 years. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker now is Orla Hegarty. Orla is assistant professor at the UCD School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy, and obviously a very well-known commentator on the housing market. Over to you, Orla. Thank you. Orla?
There we are. Thank you, McDara, and thanks for the invitation to speak this morning. And to Jessica, I think that's really hard to listen to, Jessica, and I think it brings it home to everybody how immediate this is for so many people, how stressful, and how many people are affected. It's important to hear the real stories. I took the title for this morning quite literally, and I would like to say how we solve it. I think we've spent the last 5 years talking about why we have a housing crisis and how bad it is, and the move to how we fix it has been very slow, and we've had a lot of false starts in all of that. So I suppose I'd like to speak to how we solve it, and more importantly why it's so important that we solve it. So in order to solve it, I think first off we need to have a really better understanding of what the problem is. How many people are in these situations, how many people could afford an affordable rent if it was available to them. Because I see this as more an affordability crisis than a housing crisis. We're constantly being told that it is a supply issue and supply will solve the problem. Supply won't solve the problem, because what is being supplied is too high price for most people. And the public purse has a certain limit on how much it can subsidise housing. So when you get into situations of large subsidies, very few people will benefit, and a lot more people will still be left in trouble. So I think we need to redefine this crisis as an affordability crisis. There are a lot of people who are housed, and there are people who are housed where they're happy where they're housed, but they're losing their homes because they can't afford it, or they're compromised on the rest of their life because of the lack of affordability. So they're missing opportunities maybe to move and change jobs, or to take up education and employment, or to just have some spending money at the end of the week, or to heat the place properly. So I'd like it to be defined as an affordability crisis, I think. And secondly, just to make it very positive, we have done this in the past. I was just looking at some numbers this morning. Between 1935 and 1937, so over 3 years, Dublin City Council built 6,763 new homes in Dublin. And that was at a stage in the late 1930s when this country had virtually nothing. But it gave jobs to people, and it cleared slums, and it cleared tenements, and it gave families homes. Most of those homes are still occupied and have reared generations of children in communities, and in communities where when people fell on hard times, they had the support of their neighbours, they had the continuity of school, and they had a network locally that carried them and family that carried them through hard times. What we have now is that people are very isolated and constantly being dislocated out of communities they're in. So not only is their housing, is the housing a problem, but their lack of connection and support in their community is going along with that kind of precarious situation people are in. I think the other thing that's important to remember about the 1930s is there was a living memory of pandemic then. There was living memory of Spanish flu and how that had influenced the world. And it was the time of TB. And the idea of clearing the tenements and clearing slums in cities has always been about public health. When people cleared cities of typhoid and black plague, and when they built public housing, it was often to make the city safer for people in the private housing as well, because when you have poor standards of housing, it is where disease spreads. And we can see it at the moment. The average spread in private homes is probably 2 people being per outbreak of COVID. In the traveller community, that's more like 13, and direct provision, it's more like 10. So we have people who are living in bad housing. They're not vulnerable communities. They are people who are badly housed and left in vulnerable conditions. So rehousing people safely into decent housing is a public health issue for all of us. It would be cheaper to house people than to have another shutdown. So in terms of solving the problem, there's only 4 ingredients. It only takes 4 things. The first one is land. Ireland has an advantage over many other cities that are in housing crisis in that we have a lot of land. It's a low density country. It's a low density city, and it's surrounded by lots of developable land. We're not living on an island in the city. Mel might talk a bit more about that, but we also, because of NAMA and for historical reasons, we also have a lot of land that's in public ownership or public control. So we can deal with that. And there's enough there in the short term to develop and then find mechanisms to get better value or better control of private land if it's needed for housing. That'll take all of the cost out of the housing market. The second thing we need is money, and money was a barrier up until this year because the government couldn't or were reluctant to borrow on balance sheet. That has all changed. They can now borrow off balance. They can now borrow because the rules have changed, and because money is available really cheaply, they can sometimes borrow for at no interest rate. So it's effectively free money. And compared to private developers who could be paying 15 or 20% interest. So it makes an awful lot more sense for the government to borrow it and to use their own land. The third ingredient we need is people. And last year that was a problem. We had a skills shortage. We had difficulty. There was a lot of hotels and office buildings being built. This year everything has changed. We have plenty of people in the construction industry who need work and who need continuity of work and who need regional work and skills and apprenticeships. So we have gone full circle on that. We now need jobs, and quickly, for the people in the construction industry who are out of work. And we need them to also have apprenticeship programs, so we're not pushing everybody into academic education out of school, that we're actually giving people the skills that are needed to build properly, and that continuity. And that is a really excellent recession strategy. It's also a really good climate change strategy, because the more these people have skills, the better the housing will be, the fewer people will be living in fuel poverty and will be vulnerable. And as people build more and build their skills, it gets cheaper and cheaper for them to build because they have the skills to do it quickly and properly the first time. The fourth ingredient then we need is materials. Again, we have an opportunity. We have the market in Europe that is available to us. We can tender, if the will is there, we can tender for 10,000 doors and 10,000 windows and 20,000 bathroom fittings across Europe, and take all of the cost out of a lot of those standard items and make an enormous difference to the cost of housing by just being clever about how we do it. It doesn't necessarily mean the government developing. How we build schools and hospitals is it gets designed, it gets tendered out to builders. Builders get paid every month, they pay their staff every week, and that's how we build other buildings. We don't need to engineer enormous deals to do housing where somebody's bringing the funding and there's very complex systems that are just adding cost and delay. We know how to do this efficiently and quickly. So they're the four ingredients. It's just land, money, people and materials. There are ways that we can build in value for money and affordability in all of that in order to deliver at scale. Without getting too much into the details, it is possible to deliver a 3-bedroom house or a 2-bedroom apartment in Dublin for under 250,000. I'm happy to argue those numbers with anybody, and that includes fees and VAT and all the planning charges and whatever that goes along with it. So there will be an enormous number of people who could afford a mortgage at that level. There would be an awful lot more who wouldn't need much subsidy, and rents for that would be maybe under £1,000 a month, which would be enormously affordable to people. Again, without public subsidy, they would be independent. They could move around as they saw fit and they could stand on their own 2 feet. So it needs a bit of skill and a bit of risk management to put that together. So I suppose just in conclusion, I would say 2 things. I think first, we need to separate out this idea that tenure and delivery are the same thing. What I mean by that is there might be an ideological debate to be had and an argument to be had about what percentage of housing is public, private, subsidised, what level of subsidy, who gets it, and what that is. That might for some be an ideological conversation that can be had somewhere else. But the actual delivery and building of housing isn't connected to that. It's connected to doing things efficiently and best value for money, and using, as they did in the 1930s when they had very, very little, making the best of what you've got and just getting on with it and being self-sufficient. So I would like to separate out the debates about public, private and affordable from the debate about how we actually deliver housing, because let's decide how to deliver it efficiently, and then we can figure out who gets it and how they pay for their housing. And then just to conclude on that, this is a public health issue. Housing policy is a public health policy. If we don't engage with that, we are not being resilient for future pandemic and disease. You know, if you costed out the people in Dublin who are in poor standard housing and at risk of disease, and you costed out the cost of another shutdown, I think you would very, very quickly see the cost benefit of housing people properly. And it would be an awful lot cheaper to take all of the empty hotel rooms, all of the empty student rooms, all of the empty tourist Airbnbs in Dublin at the moment, and to house people properly for December and January would be an awful lot cheaper than closing the economy again. So I would like to see a much wider debate about how important housing is, I suppose, generally to wider policy.
Thank you, Orla, and thank you for highlighting how resolvable this situation is, because I think we're often presented with a situation with the view that this is somehow intractable and it will always be with us, and that is not the case, as you've clearly demonstrated. But obviously leads to the question, or begs the question then, why hasn't this happened? And that's something that we continue to ponder. Our next speaker now is Mel Reynolds, and Mel is, as you probably know, is a registered architect with wide experience in project management, conservation, urban design and housing, and he's also a regular contributor to this debate. Mel.
Thanks for that. That's a great phrase Jessica used earlier, privilege of choice. It's really, really good. And I think what we're seeing is, just as an overview, you know, government policy seems to be passed along depending on what regime is in place. And we're seeing a lot of things unfolding like O'Devany Gardens that really were initiated years ago and are just being passed irrespective of who's in government at the time. What I'll do is I'll just give you a very brief sort of overview of where I think things are at the moment in the housing sector. And then I'll just go in and give you a couple of what I think are sort of key metrics in this whole area. And you can come to your own conclusions. Certainly it's great to hear, you know, this is very solvable, you know, and we have the land. We know that we have, I think at the end of 2018, somewhere in the region of enough land in state control, excluding CIE, Creilsha, other state agencies, for well over 100,000 units nationwide. And in Dublin, there's enough publicly controlled land for about maybe 40 to 50,000 dwellings. So the key sort of raw material that's needed in terms of affordability and for social housing and to drive prices down, we have an abundance of. And you know, Dublin City itself, if you're driving through Dublin City, 3 out of every 4 vacant sites you see are either owned by NAM or owned by Dublin City Council. So if you think, you know, land in Ireland is not a scarce resource, and even in terms of unzoned land, which is land that could be used in future for, say, another Cherrywood, which would be totally affordable, between Fingal County Council and South Dublin County Council combined, they own 67 square kilometres of land of all types of zoning. So, you know, that's the same as a small European country. San Marino is 65 square kilometres. So we have an enormous amount of land. We just need to start using it in a more direct fashion for estate building. So I suppose the housing sector, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It looks like things stalled a bit, but the same problems that we had before this are staying with us. Prices haven't really dropped. Land is still being bid up in the private sector. You're still seeing an awful lot of state activity in the purchase of houses for turnkeys. We're still seeing a lot of funds involved in buying blocks for expensive build-to-let schemes. So, you know, when things die down, when the current crisis dies down, we're going to see the same problems that we had before. Affordable and social housing really for me are the same thing. They're sort of two strands of the same piece of rope. And I think that's continued to be a blind spot in terms of official policy. Currently the government have a real problem with this. Now, just to give a couple of sort of key metrics about the demand, supply, and other factors. If we look on the demand side, you know, if you take the total number of people on housing waiting lists, like Jessica is, if you take the total number of people who are on HAP, who are on very significant subsidies for rental, nationwide, you probably have about 124,000 people, which is an enormous demand. Roughly speaking, I think the HAP figure at the moment is about 57,000 according to the CSO. So it's a huge figure. We also know from a deeper report done, I think in March 2018, that the cost of rent support in areas of high demand in County Dublin is actually twice the cost of building and owning over a 30-year period. So the state policy, which is to increase the HAP choice-based rental system, has gone from, I think 2015 it was 5,000 up to 57,000. Is hugely expensive in Dublin. Not so much outside, but of course the real problems areas are in areas of high demand like Dublin. If we look at the figure for Dublin for that sort of social and affordable demand figure in Dublin is, I think it's around 40,000, 40 to 45,000. So it's a huge figure. That's an awful lot of people who are either looking for social housing or looking for affordability in the housing sector. It's an enormous demand figure. On the supply side, I think the best figure to look at that demonstrates policy is actual local authority builds, what is built directly. And when you strip away the amount of houses that are purchased, I think last year somewhere in the region of 25% of all new housing was purchased as turnkeys from the private sector, which there was a very recent deeper report on that, and they've also noted that the practice of purchasing turnkey new homes from the private sector in County Dublin is twice the cost, significantly higher than building on state land. I think Ona Bryn, who's in the panel here as well, did a PQ more recently as well, which more or less confirmed the same thing. There was a Society of Chartered Surveyors, they're the quantity surveyors, the people who actually cost building. They did a report earlier in the year and they confirmed that the average cost of building on state land is between 140 to 160,000 euros cheaper per unit in Dublin if it's done by the state directly on land it owns. That's including all costs. So like between the state agencies, industry, all the fingers are pointing towards the state actually building directly. But if we look at the actual output last year, the total output for local authority builds nationwide was 1,088 homes, which is a lot less than we're being led to believe in the media. That's actually a drop from the previous year. In 2018, it was 1,238 homes. So the output that local authorities are doing directly on land they own is falling at the moment year on year. The output of the 4 Dublin local authorities was 228 homes. That's for the big 4 that we have. And that figure is actually less than the 2017 figure for the Dublin County, which was 232. So we're seeing less houses being built last year than built in 2017. But what has expanded are the turnkey purchases, where they've doubled. So last year it was well over 4,000 units were purchased from the private sector. The previous year it was about 2,000. So there's actually a strategic risk there to the housing sector if we start unpicking this. The interesting thing about Dublin City Council has a combined figure of about 20,000 people in housing demand in terms of, on housing list or looking for HAP or on HAP. And their output last year was 45 units, 45 new homes. And out of that, 24 Priory Hall refurbs were counted as new homes in that figure. So when Dublin City Council says that they cannot build for less than 400,000, what they're saying is, based on the absolutely minute amount of new builds that they've done, which are probably very difficult and in very difficult locations, that their costs on those really small number of units was in excess of 400,000. We know that, as Orla has said, Fingal, South Dublin, even Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, the most expensive place to buy or rent in the country, are significantly cheaper than DCC at the moment. So, the demand on one side is 20,000, and the supply by the state, when it's in total control of land, cheap finance, procurement, the planning system, etc., is 0.01% of it. It's absolutely tiny. So this is why we're presented with this sort of intractable situation. This will never, it's like this because the state activity is so low. And this is a sort of an inherited policy that the current government have from the previous one, etc. So it's, we do know that there's oceans of land there. We have it. We have all this capacity. It can be done very easily, and I suppose in terms of the political end of it, what we have seen is, and I'm sure that other people will talk about, is the O'Devany Gardens vote. I think the penny has dropped for an awful lot of public representatives. The thing that was eye-catching for me was the fact that councillors voted with such a majority to bid for the state to build on its own land. In conclusion, just in terms of the PPPs, the old form of PPP, Rory Hearn will confirm it. It was on the basis of you give land to a developer, they give you units back for free, social housing back for free, and they charge everyone else a fortune for the balance of the units. They get to pocket the rest. Our current version of PPPs, 12, 14 years later, are where you give the land for free to a developer, you pay a premium to get the social housing back, you actually pay cost plus, and then they sell on the units as well. So it's great to see local authority representatives, councillors getting into the long grass of this and realizing that the picture isn't as complicated as you're being led to believe. It's actually very simple. And there are people like Orla around here who tell you exactly how to do it. It's not rocket science. We can do it. And we just need to get on and have the political will to press through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Informative as always, and again, raised the question, if HAP and acquisitions and so on, current policy are so expensive and we can build for far cheaper, why in God's name aren't we doing it? You referenced Owen O'Brien being in the session. Owen is actually, he's in the next session starting after 12:30, and he'll be joined obviously by representatives from Labour, People for Profit and the Social Democrats. As I say, that session starting after 12:30. Our next speaker now is Rosemary Hennigan, and Rosemary is a policy coordinator with Focus and is speaking here today on her work at the Home for Good network, which is seeking to have a right to housing placed in the Constitution. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thanks, McDara, and I suppose thanks to the other speakers as well. I think it kind of put this all in context, especially to Jess, the importance of housing as a human right. I suppose that's what the right to housing is all about. It's about changing the way in which we view housing as a country and kind of culturally, and sending a strong statement about our values and our principles and inserting that into the Constitution. Because after all, without housing, all of our other basic rights and our other basic needs become a luxury, and that's not right, I suppose. So speaking on behalf of Home for Good, this is a coalition of housing and homeless NGOs, academics, activists and lawyers with the goal of securing a referendum on the right to housing. And our members include Focus Ireland, Simon Communities, Respond, Threshold, Mercy Law Resource Centre, legal and academic experts, and Force the Trade Union. And Home for Good is also a member of Raise the Roof. So we're currently trying to build out this coalition and expand the broad civil society grassroots coalition to insert the right to housing in the Constitution. So I'll tell you a little bit about our thinking on the right to housing at the moment, and then I would definitely ask you to get in touch if this is something that you'd be interested in supporting, which I'm sure many people listening to me today will be. So the first question is, why a right to housing? And I suppose we have kind of heard from a number of speakers today, but there is no single cause of the housing crisis, and therefore there's no single solution. But one barrier that has been kind of viewed over the past few years of our experience of this housing crisis is the current interpretation of constitutional rights protecting private property. So a referendum on the right to housing is designed to address this particular barrier and to make the Constitution help rather than hinder solutions and policy solutions that others at this event have kind of outlined for us. So I think it's important to remember that it's part of a broader solution to the housing crisis, and it's about empowering the state to act and empowering individuals to vindicate their rights when they're breached. So I suppose the right to housing it's not an unusual thing. There are 83 constitutions that protect the right to housing across the world. So it's recognised as an aspect of international human rights law in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and under EU law in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And in 2014 here in Ireland, the Constitutional Convention recommended inclusion of the right to housing in the Constitution, with 84% of the Convention voting in favour of that. So we also now have a commitment to a referendum in the programme for government. So there is a little bit of momentum building around a right to housing, and we need to kind of build on that a little bit more. So there's two things primarily that a right to housing will do. The first is it would require the state to recognise, to protect and to vindicate housing as a right, and to balance this against property in the Constitution. And the second thing, very importantly, is it would provide a basic floor of protection for individuals who would otherwise fall through the gaps in our current legal system. And I think, again, those gaps arise. So I suppose the current situation that we're in is something of a constitutional bind. So without boring everybody by going too deeply into the law, I think it is interesting and important that we kind of understand the background and where this is coming from. So as many of you will know, the Constitution currently protects private property under Articles 43 and 40.3. And Article 43 protects the institution of private property, and it allows the exercise of property rights to be limited in the common good. And then Article 40.3 protects a personal right to private property from unjust attack. That's language in the Constitution. But there's no equivalent right to housing which is balanced against these property rights. And that means that a legal analysis will start from the existence of this protected property right, state's duty to protect that right from unjust attack. So the consequences of that framing has led to what constitutional experts say is a very conservative interpretation of how rights can be limited in the common good. And the case law in this area is decades old, with property rights not being tested before the courts in recent times, particularly in the context of the housing crisis. And that's important to remember because case law does change, and particularly when the underlying economic and social context of the country changes. That's an important point. So recent statements made by the government about constitutionality are based on advice received from the Attorney General's office rather than judgments of the courts. So this means that if the government is advised by the Attorney General that a bill is unconstitutional, it will not progress that bill. And the bill will kind of remain where it is, usually at stage 2 of the process. So this means that the position then defaults back to a conservative interpretation of the Constitution. And this has had a chilling effect on our housing policy and law. So the political debate then shuts down at that point, and the debate on the merits of a particular housing policy doesn't progress. And I think that's been a really significant barrier, which we've all seen over the past few years. And a practical example of this is 16 bills have been blocked on constitutional grounds over the last decade. And constitutionality is frequently cited in political debate on measures like the eviction ban at the moment or rent freezes as well. And again, that means that we shut down at that point and we don't really investigate the substantive merits or possible demerits of particular policy positions. And that's been bad for us and for our housing policy, as we've seen. So I suppose the underlying point is that we really need to fairly balance private property rights against right to housing. And in the absence of that standalone right to housing, we haven't been able to do that. The other important point then is access to courts. So a right to housing would also enable the court to intervene where the state has failed to properly vindicate and protect the right. And this is kind of relevant mostly in very serious cases. So it's where the courts might find that the state has breached the right. It might say that the state must act to remedy that breach, but it'll usually be in serious cases. And I suppose that's worth bearing in mind as well. The other thing about it is the courts won't say how the state should act. That's because the separation of powers will still apply. And the test that will be applied is reasonableness. So the court, in looking to ask, is the state acting reasonably here? And I think that's kind of a fair way to frame it. So in terms of how the right will look, and I know there's been some concern around, floodgates and litigation before the courts kind of being a huge negative thing which might come out of a right to housing, but it's very unlikely to operate that way. It's much more likely to operate similarly to Article 42, which is the right to free primary education. So that means it's not a school of your choice in your neighbourhood or at the end of your road. You do have a right to free primary education. And similarly, a right to housing won't be a right to a free house in a place of your choice, but it will be a recognition that you as an individual do have a right to housing. So in terms of what this would look like, it's about a rebalancing of rights under the Constitution, and it would ensure that we could enact policy solution to this crisis and ensure a basic floor of protection for individuals, which isn't there at the moment. So Home for Good is proposing a standalone clause, something like Article 43A, which would first of all contain a statement explicitly recognising the existence of the right to housing, which we currently don't have. It would then require the state to take action. So that would change. It means that you wouldn't be able to just default back to the private market. The state would have to, at various times, step in where necessary if the right to housing was otherwise being neglected. And it means that where there are serious failings, an individual would have access to the courts and would be able to say, my right has been breached here. So I suppose that's an absolutely flying tour through it, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview, and hopefully it might kind of begin to stimulate a little bit more debate around what a right to housing would look like and what the parameters of that right should be. And in terms of what will come next, well, the first thing is we need a timetable for a referendum. So we need a date to be set. And the second thing is we need to see the wording of an amendment, and that needs to be agreed and published by government. So I think the wording is very important because we need to make sure that the right to housing will make a difference, and that it won't just kind of be a non-justiciable right. This needs to be something that will actually make an impact. So I suppose part of this is to build a campaign then to the referendum, and that means civil society and the grassroots momentum will be really important. So what we really need is people who are interested in Raise the Roof or to housing to kind of, I suppose, know that this is the moment to act. So you can find out more by going to www.homeforgood.ie. You can follow Home for Good on Twitter. You can use the hashtag Home for Good. But really, we want to see kind of the right to housing become something that we talk about in the context of this housing crisis and really kind of build on that momentum, because now is the time. We do have that commitment under the programme for government. So let's kind of make some progress on it. Thanks very much. Thank
you, Rosemary. I think you're actually the only speaker who's actually come in on time so far today, so congratulations on that. And you actually give a very concise and precise summary of what can be a very, very complex legal issue, or is often presented as such, what is actually at root essentially just a human rights issue, as Jessica has already alluded to. Okay, our final speaker in this session then is a very patient man indeed. He's been waiting for a while. Anthony Flynn, whose background is in community and voluntary work, and Anthony who founded Inner City Helping Homeless in 2013 in response to what he was seeing on our streets daily. Anthony is also a member of Dublin City Council for the North Inner City. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks, McDara, and well done for putting this together. So look, I'm going to touch on some, listening to Mel, and Mel, some of the stuff that you said really reminisces, because over the last number of months we've been told by Dublin City Council that we haven't got land and that there's not enough land and we're going to run out of land over the next number of years and we won't have land to build on. And, listening to you, saying it's very solvable, it's something that I believe is very solvable. It's something that we should be aiming to be building on that land that is available to us. But the Deputy Chief keeps coming back to us. And I suppose, look, as McDara said, I'm wearing two hats here today. My position as a Dublin City Councillor, I was very active and vocal in terms of the O'Devany Gardens land, and that's in my constituency. And I suppose, we didn't win. We didn't win the war there. We had a couple of good battles, all right. And only over the last number of weeks we've been actually up looking at that development, and the basically being told that development is going to be extended. The density is going to rise. It's not going to. It's not going to be the original plan that was put in place, or that was presented to the community, or even presented to the Dublin Agreement parties over that agreement. We're being told that on board Canala are now saying that the density needs to rise and we need to be putting more build on that land. And I suppose Oscar Traynor, some of the stuff that happened over the last number of weeks with Oscar Traynor Road, to see such a U-turn from so many parties, and I suppose to see agreement, I think that the public outcry and dismay really hit home an awful lot of the political parties in terms of Ebony Gardens, and you know, that really changed the narrative in terms of what was happening with Oscar Traynor. I know John Lyons had put a really hard graft and shift in there in regard to that campaign. And I suppose, look, you know, what we're hearing again, you know, when we hear Mel talking about things being very solvable, and then we go to the council and we're being told, oh no, we can't do this. This is something that can't be done. You know, there was no other options put in front of us in terms of Ebony Gardens. That's what it is. That's what it looks like. And you know, what you're being fed is what you're being fed by management, and that's it. And that was the same kind of narrative that came about with Oscar Traynor Road. And you know what. You know, we heard, and I suppose everybody in the forum here heard the Deputy Chief again talk about how, you know, if we don't build on that land and we don't go with this programme and we don't go with this narrative, you know, nothing's going to be built for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you know. And I believe that's, you know, it was ludicrous to even make that statement, and even that he wasn't willing to work with some of us in trying to develop something else or other options on that. And you know, when we look at from Sinn Féin's perspective and things that were suggested in terms of that land, you know, there was the next day people were talking, people were on the phones, people were ringing each other. Okay, how can we move this on? How can we progress this? Because you know, 853 homes is an awful lot of homes, and you know, nobody wants to see homes not being built. But I suppose I've learned over the last 18 months or so, you know, in my position as a Dublin City Councillor, that what we seem to be doing a hell of a lot of is funding the private sector. And we continue to fund that private sector. And everything from, I suppose, again, wearing two hats, from homeless services in terms of me seeing what I'm seeing on a daily basis and the expenditure that we're spending. And, you know, from what Orla had said about, you know, a public health issue, we saw all the stops being pulled out in COVID wave 1, and we saw access to hostels and B&Bs. And then when we went and looked at managers' orders and we saw the kind of money that was being spent, you know, into private emergency accommodation. Last night we passed a budget with Dublin City Council on 214 million, 20% of the overall Dublin City Council budget is being spent on homeless services. And the majority of that money is actually being reinvested into private operators. And, you know, I've seen such a shift over the last 6 months in terms of, you know, moving away from the NGO and the providers that, you know, would normally have the wraparound support services that are needed for people that enter homeless services. And, you know, something that, one thing I've seen over the last number of years really is, you know, nobody that comes into homeless services actually gets an exit plan. You know, we talk about an exit plan. The first thing that should happen when you enter homeless services, you should be given an exit plan. You know, and I know Owen had brought a motion forward about, you know, how long you should be in homeless services. And, you know, there's no definitive exit plan for anybody that enters homeless services. I was shocked and awed. One of my case management team came to me a couple of weeks ago and said to me they had somebody that was in a hostel that was funded by Dublin City Council and was ran by an NGO, and that person had been in a hostel for 2.5 years. The person hadn't got a housing application form at Dublin City Council filled in for 2.5 years in a homeless hostel. You know, so we talk about the systemic failures, you know, from governmental point of view and from Dublin City Council's point of view. But I suppose, you know, the shift in terms of how we continue to sustain a private market. And I know, you know, everybody in this forum has said at some stage, you know, along the lines that, you know, the monies that are being spent into, whether it be HAP or whether it be, you know, to private build or private developments, you know, all we have seen over the last number of months, back to Orla's point of being a public health issue, is this massive expenditure into private operators, you know. And I think we should touch on some of, you know, the media this week in terms of deaths within homeless services. You know, it's shocking to see, you know, and I know, again, back to the forum, there's a lot of people are outspoken in terms of how bad we have actually done in terms of people that have died and passed away in homeless services this year. And, you know, I spoke to Owen on the phone the other night about this, that, you know, we're only seeing a Dublin figure. We're only seeing people, you know, 55, I think 56 people is what we have at the moment in terms of deaths in Dublin. And, you know, we're not getting a countrywide figure. We're talking to people that are down in Cork, Katrina, Toomey that's down there. We're talking to people in Galway and Limerick and, you know, across the country. And everybody is stating that they are seeing an increase in deaths. And I attribute that back to, I suppose, the shift into private emergency accommodation providers that haven't got the wraparound support services that we need in order to get that exit plan in place for people that do enter homeless services. And when we again talk about the private operators, we're in a position really where all of those operators are there as businesses. They're there to run a business. They're not there to provide the supports that the likes of Peter McVerry Trust or Focus or Simon or Inner City Help Homes or any other organisation will provide. They're there to make a profit. And, you know, just down the road here from my office, I saw a building that was put in place over the last number of months. And, you know, there was 40 beds, bunk beds put into a room. And we're averaging about 130, some of the figures that have been released over the last couple of weeks. You know, one facility on Talbot Street, where 112 rooms in that facility at €135 per night, per room. You know, it's shocking figures. And I suppose we keep maintaining that, you know, and I do believe that there's a narrative here in terms of maintaining and sustaining homelessness, and there's not enough conversation about eradicating homelessness and getting rid of homelessness. You know, and again, back to that exit plan and giving everybody that enters homeless services an exit plan. You know, those figures released the other day in terms of how long it's going to take to clear the Dublin housing waiting list, and I think it was 25 or 29 years before everybody on that housing list is going to be housed, you know, which is absolutely ludicrous. And, you know, it goes back again to saying we have the land, we have, you know, the resources in terms of build, but I don't think we have the political will in order to build. And, you know, when we look at, I suppose, the ban on co-living, I don't think it will be a full ban. I think I will probably touch on it later on. But, you know, there's a number, I suppose, of narratives in terms of continuously funding private operators, private development, and not actually, like, you know, leasing out some of the units. One of the biggest issues in terms of our Devney Gardens for me was that we were actually going to buy those units back at something like 480,000, like €500,000. Like, it was ridiculous to say, and we own nothing. We actually own nothing at the end of this, you know, and to go back and actually gift the level of land that we were gifting, and then to you know, not own anything at the end and actually have to go then and borrow or ask voluntary housing bodies, and the over-reliance on them voluntary housing bodies and the pressure being put on voluntary housing bodies at the moment. You know, I think that, you know, when we look at the Trust, for instance, you know, is probably one of the biggest landlords in the state now because of the over-reliance on those voluntary housing bodies to provide homes. What we need to do is go back to, you know, we need to go back to basics. We need to go back to basics in terms of the council. We need to go back to basics in terms of councils right across the country. You know, and we need to ask those councils to build themselves. And the only way, I suppose, to get us out of the crisis that we are in at the moment is to do that. So that's me, McDarragh.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Anthony. Listen, we have some, we're limited on time, but we have some questions coming in from the chat. Jessica, if you're still there, could I ask you one thing? Have you seen or heard anything from the new government that took office a few months ago? Have you seen or heard anything that they have done or said that might give you any hope or any sign of encouragement as to a change or a way forward?
Absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely.
Would you see the change coming then?
I see the change coming in them admitting and stop tinkering around the edges of it, because just what Anthony said there, everything is going into private, all the money is being funneled into private enterprises, and that's what this is about. And it's a way of keeping the system going. I mean, things like HAP and rent allowance, I mean, it's the housing equivalent of a soup kitchen. You know, it's basically people can't, you know, they're just keeping it going to keep a lid on it, because they won't deal with saying to the general public, look, this system is not sustainable. We need public building on public land, and we need to bring in all these empty dwellings. People forget about that as well. You know, all these empty things, people are allowed to sit on them. You know, ordinary investors or big investors, random landlords, all this has to be addressed. If I saw that, I'd have hope. You know, while you're building, you could also be bringing in much quicker time. You know, I mean, Anthony says 29 years to clear the housing list. I'll probably be dead by then. You know, so that's kind of what has to happen. They're tinkering around the edge. They're not actually grasping the essence of it.
Okay. A question then, I think that I want to direct towards both Orla and Mel, whoever wants to come in first. Look, you've both said essentially that the solutions are there, that the solutions are very simple and are very obvious, and that in fact we've actually done this before, so it's not rocket science and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So what's the problem then? Is it lack of capacity at official level? Is it ideology? Have we essentially privatized what used to be public provision? Orla?
Do you want me to come in on that? Or Mel, do you want to go first?
Mel, maybe?
You fire ahead, Orla.
Oh gosh, I mean, I suppose we could rehearse how we got here, and there's a whole load of reasons going back into the boom, the bank crash, the recovery, the ghost estate. I mean, there's a long saga, I suppose, behind it, and why money is flowing the way it is in certain directions, and why certain decisions are being made. But we are where we are, you know, and I think. You know, I think sometimes what's been missed maybe, and there's, you know, when people talk about ideology and things, there's still a sort of assumption that it's the 1970s and 2/3 of people could afford their own home. Nobody in Dublin can afford their own home anymore. Very, very small number. Certainly people on average salaries, like I think it's something like 80% of the people earning in Dublin can't afford to live in Dublin. So the context has changed completely. And when we hear a resistance to public housing, it's often conflated with what people might have seen as a kind of residual council housing in the past, rather than the fact that this is nearly everybody in Dublin now that has, you know, been priced out of this market. And so it's not a case of there are a marginal number of people now who need subsidised housing. The market has been engineered to a point where the vast majority of people who are working in Dublin, and that impacts on labour mobility, it impacts on pressure on employers to pay people more, commuting distances, childcare costs, everything else is being impacted by this engineered high price housing system.
Mel, do you want to come in there?
Well, I suppose really what we have is we're probably no different to places like San Francisco or, you know, parts of London as well, where we've, you know, ultra low interest rates, which are going to give you very high prices. We know the correlation there is very strong. It's over 0.9. If you look even during the pandemic, all of the fiscal stuff that we've seen has all been about maintaining asset prices, about flooding the market with cash. So it should be no surprise to any official that we have very high asset prices, that rents are high and that units are high as well. I suppose what we've done in Ireland is, because we have effectively no public housing being built at all for the past 5 or 6 years, or very low levels, we've a very volatile market. So we know, for example, for profiteers, people coming in buying land, we have a very lucrative market here for it. If you look at, like Anthony, that figure that you said of €135 per night for substandard emergency accommodation, that if you look at the Irish Times cover yesterday, you'll see a new scheme in Ranelagh was launched. They look very smart, lovely luxury houses. They're about, I think, 1.2 or 1.3 million euros. That nightly cost will fund the rental of one of those houses per month. The figure I've heard is you could rent one for maybe 4,000 a month. So that's what €135 is being spent in substandard, you know, 3-star accommodation for emergency accommodation will fund a luxury 3-bed in Ranelagh for a month. So what we've seen is I think there's sort of a mechanics here of how decisions are made, government policy. Certainly my limited experience of it is an awful lot of policies introduced in a very ad hoc way with very little thought or modelling, and then all the effort goes in to defend it once it's there. So you can see this all over the place. And I mean, Anthony, Jessica, you're at the cold face on this. You're banging your head off the wall on it. But like, there is no reason for, in the morning, if the minister wanted to turn around and say 3 ministerial orders would free up an awful lot of vacant housing, streamline building control. We can borrow, you'll actually be paid to borrow money for 20 years if you're a government. So why are we continuing to plow money in? Like, this crisis didn't happen overnight. You can understand if something needs to be done, buy it, do it, rent it immediately. This has been on the go since 2015 and through a number of different, is it 4 ministers now at this stage? So, you know, what you probably need is a very strong political will to turn it around. There are local authorities that do it really well. not to, you know, if you Louth are really good, they have very limited funds, and they're doing an awful lot of vacant stuff, buying, CPOing, buying and refurbishing. Limerick Regen are knocking the ball out of the park. And I think, Anthony, what you could do is you could say to the chief executive in Dublin City is go off then on a 6-month sabbatical to Limerick Regen, and they'll train you on how to do regeneration works. And their budget, I think, for the next 2 years, about 170 million. And the stuff they're doing there is phenomenal. So we probably need a couple of the Munster lads to come to Dublin and to sort them out and give them a few lessons. But there are some local authorities that are doing great stuff. But the difficulty is when you have a systemic problem, it's very easy for people who either don't understand it or don't want to understand it to do very little. And I think we've a bit of that at the moment. We've a broken through. And the 4-stage procurement process, as Ona Bren knows as well, and all the politicians, is a disaster. It's a car crash. And we inherited that from the bust. So it's a mix of a number of different things. But if you know what you're at and if you want to do it, you can start doing it in the morning. Simple as that.
Okay, thanks for that, Mel. Listen, we're right up against time. We're actually running over time a little bit. We have to move now to the next session. Once again, a big thank you to everybody who's participated and contributed to this session here this morning. We're going to take a break now, a short break of a couple of minutes. So stay with us. We can push some of the questions that have been raised here into the next session as well, because the faces will change, but the themes remain the same, and the discussion remains the same. So we're going to take, as I say, a short break, and we'll be back with you in about 5 minutes, and Frank Connolly will be taking over the chair. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome back to the second part of this Raise the Roof housing webinar. We've had a very good attendance for the first session, and which, as you all heard, was quite fascinating, and the contributions really made this issue much simpler than we would be led to believe. I'm going to start the session because we only have an hour or a little bit more, and introduce our first panelist, Owen O'Brien, whom of course is familiar to everybody, housing, local government and planning, housing planning and local government spokesperson for Sinn Féin, TD for Dublin Midwest, and author of Home, Why Public Housing is the Answer. Owen, I'll let you kick off. You were present for the last session, so you can take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank. And first of all, thank you to Raise the Roof for organising the event. There's been at least 120 people throughout the earlier session, which is fantastic. And I think it shows you the huge appetite for this issue. I also have to say it's been a really lively series of questions and comments, and it might be worthwhile sharing or finding some way to share those afterwards, because we may not get to all of them. The morning session, I suppose, dealt with the technicalities of how we got here and a whole range of solutions. So I don't want to repeat any of that, and I want to maybe shift the focus a little bit onto the politics, and particularly the politics of how we get some of the solutions outlined by speakers earlier on today implemented. It's useful to start by saying that this day a year ago, we were in the final days of a by-election campaign in my own constituency in Dublin Midwest. And while we probably didn't fully appreciate it at the time, the housing crisis and the huge volume of housing activism from a whole range of organisations, and including this network Raise the Roof, played a central role in the dramatic decline in the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil vote. And also, I have to say, in the Sinn Féin victory in that by-election, my colleague Mark Ward. Within a few weeks after that, the government had collapsed. We were in a general election. And most commentators have described that as a general election which, above all other issues, was about housing. And you could see a range of parties who were advocating alternative policies to the failed policy consensus of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael did exceptionally well. We now have a new government. We have a programme for government that has a large section called Housing for All. So it's useful to ask, has much changed? And I suppose to start with the bad news, unfortunately, if you look particularly at the budget that was agreed in October, not a lot has changed. Capital investment in public housing to meet social and affordable need remains way below the level it should be. Current expenditure, particularly rental subsidies such as HAP-RAS, rent supplement and long-term leasing, will hit over €1 billion for the first time in the history of the state next year. And we're still not seeing an adequate recognition of the scale of the affordability crisis, the crisis in the rental sector, but also the very specific accommodation needs of travellers, of people with disabilities, of migrants, and also we have the ongoing scandal of direct provision. So while the government at a rhetorical level are promising much change so far, at least at the budgetary level, we're not seeing that change. Key things that the government has done since taking office. The first is they removed the very substantial protections that had been introduced during the interregnum, the ban on evictions, to quit and rent increases, and the overwhelming majority of renters were then exposed to the vagaries of the market at a time when public health and public health considerations should have seen that blanket ban continue into next year. We have seen 2 limited protections for renters introduced on foot of that. The limited protection for renters who are in rent arrears because of COVID-19 income loss, and obviously the ban on evictions, which of course will end in about 14 days time, that was introduced at level 5. We've seen some tinkering around at the edges. Thresholds for things like the repair and lease scheme have been increased marginally, and the government made a so-called call for housing to buy 1-bed and 4-bedroom units of accommodation to try and get people out of emergency accommodation, but it's all pretty modest stuff. And probably the only significant thing the government has done is announced this week a ban on co-living, although we have yet to see the actual circular which will inform that, so I'll reserve judgment on how blanket that ban on co-living is until I see the circular. If it's a blanket ban, I warmly welcome it, and it's a credit to the huge amount of campaigning work many people have done, including people on this panel and the last. There's been a couple of significant developments beyond the government, which I think we need to reflect on. And the first, of course, is the Oireachtas Housing Committee, for the first time in its history, has seen a majority of TDs publicly support the holding of a referendum to enshrine the right to housing in the Constitution that happened when Home for Good came and presented to us earlier. And what that means is that if the government accepts the will of the committee, we could move to see that referendum in the lifetime of this government. The programme for government, of course, only commits to a referendum on housing, not a constitutional right referendum, but that at least is one small opening. The overwhelming majority of Dublin City councillors refusing to transfer land at no cost to a private developer in Oscar Traynor Road is also very significant. In a sense, that creates the first real litmus test for this government. Will Darragh O'Brien put his money where his mouth is and provide Dublin City Council and their councillors with a financing package that allows that housing development to be developed where it's fully public to meet social and affordable housing need? And that's going to be a very important campaign, and a lot of good cross-party work and community activism is already happening. And then on the policy front, the National Economic and Social Council only 2 weeks ago published a really important updated report, Action to Deliver Change, where once again they're calling for systemic and far-reaching housing policy change if we're going to meet the housing crisis full on. I suppose it's also important to mention that while COVID has raised a whole series of public health concerns, and Orla Hegarty dealt with those adequately, so I don't want to repeat that. Interestingly, COVID-19 and its impact on the private market creates a series of opportunities for public housing. So that, for example, there will be lots of housing developments or potential housing developments in the private sector that are now not going to happen in the next number of years because mortgage approvals and drawdowns are falling and private sector investors are getting cold feet. There is an opportunity for the state to step in and, subject to very strict value for money controls, acquire those developments and roll them out as fully public housing developments to meet social and affordable housing need. That means that the debate around turnkeys that we've all been involved in needs to be paused a little bit. We cannot eradicate turnkeys in the near future, particularly given the need to keep all of those construction workers in employment. What we need to ensure, however, is where turnkeys or acquisition of private developments to become public developments is taking place, it's done under very strict value for money criteria, and the state gets a very significant discount. So I suppose to conclude, Frank, the Raise the Roof agenda is more important now than ever before. And the fact that we have a broad-based civil society and trade union-led campaign, but with lots of party political backing, is crucial. We need a referendum to enshrine the right to housing in the Constitution as a matter of urgency for all the reasons that Rosemary said earlier. But a constitutional right means nothing if we don't have the level of capital investment at a central government level commensurate to the level of need that's out there. So that call of Raise the Roof to double capital investment, to double the output, so we have a minimum of 20,000 public homes to meet social and affordable need on an annual basis, is absolutely key. We also need proper regulation and protection of the private rental sector in terms of reducing rents, in terms of banning rent increases, and ensuring lifetime security of tenure for tenants who comply with their tenancy agreements. And we also have to then tackle the crises at the margins of our housing system. Government has introduced several hundred housing first tenancies to get those in homelessness into their own permanent home. We need thousands of those tenancies, not hundreds. We need increases in mental health and addiction supports to tackle the crisis that Anthony mentioned earlier around the dramatic increase in deaths. And we also need to keep the focus on both single and family homelessness and those with children. The situation for traveller accommodation is worse now than ever before. The levels of underspend at a local authority level and the as yet unimplemented recommendations of the expert group on traveller accommodation, we cannot lose sight of that. And also housing for people with disabilities, again, always an afterthought at the centre of housing policy debates, and we can't forget that. And there's obviously a very live debate about how we end direct provision and what we replace it with. And whatever we replace it with, it has to be human rights centred. It has to treat those in the asylum application process with dignity. But it also has to be a system that is not allowing private landlords or private developers to make huge profits off the taxpayer. So look, Frank, that's my view. Sinn Féin remains absolutely committed to Raise the Roof. And maybe to finish on this, I think given the level of interest that we have here today, it would be great to see more seminars. There was a little discussion amongst some of us on social media about the need to maybe have a seminar in the future to give a voice to those directly affected by the housing crisis at the very margins. And for example, voices from the front line of the housing crisis session, with voices from the traveller community, from migrants, from those in direct provision, those in the hard end of the rental sector, I think would be a really good thing, because it's one thing listening to politicians and academics and practitioners. We also need, as our first speaker today so eloquently put it, we need to hear the real lived experiences of those who are suffering because of the bad policies of previous governments. We commit ourselves to delivering the kind of change that people want into the future. Thanks very much, Frank.
Very expensive as usual, and it does raise questions. We, as Owen said there, we will share the questions afterwards, but we'll also try and get through as many as we can before the end of this session. And I would ask the speakers to stick as rigidly as Owen almost did to the 5 minutes that I've suggested. If we could, Senator Rebecca Moynihan is the Labour Party spokesperson on housing planning and local government, and Rebecca is also, as I mentioned, a newly appointed senator, or new senator. So, Rebecca, do you want to give us your contribution?
Yeah, thanks a million, Frank. And I'm really hoping that coming after Owen on the issue of housing is not my life for the next couple of years, because I'm sure to fail on that if it is. So I'm going to repeat some of the points that speakers have already made, and maybe just talk about long-term social housing and what some other countries are doing. So I think we're failing in three key areas in terms of the housing crisis. I think the first is in relation to the issue of renters. An awful lot of people in very insecure rental tenancies. We saw some relief this year for people in that in the course because of COVID, but I think there's an awful lot of people, as a proportion of their income, are paying very high rates of rent. And when you have a shock like this, and we see that people who are in things like the hospitality sector, in the pub sector and retail, were more likely to lose their job. They're also more likely to be renters. Some soft cushioning has taken place. There was an enhanced rent supplement scheme, but the department didn't really didn't publicise the rent supplement scheme at all. Owen had to put in, I think, an FOI at the early stage to get it, because they wouldn't ask it in a parliamentary question. I had a parliamentary question to ask when it was going to be extended after the eviction ban was ended, and that took a good amount of digging to even get them to confirm that the enhanced rent supplement was in place in terms of the circular. And this was in September. But in longer term, we are a country that probably has one of the lowest levels of protections for renters. And you listen to Jessica there speak very, very eloquently, as somebody who's involved in the arts, doesn't have a secure income in order to be able to get a mortgage, and so is reliant on the private rented sector, because she's never going to be reached on the housing list. And after 15 years of being somewhere, she's facing, at an older age, into couch surfing. And we have a ticking time bomb in terms of people who are renting that will probably end up retiring in the next 10 to 15 years because of the decisions that we took in the mid-2000s to essentially exit from the housing market. The next area I think that we're really failing in is social housing. And I want to touch on, I think, the reasons that local authorities decided to take themselves out of the social housing market. And a couple of the questions that are coming up here ask, is there an ideological blockage to getting involved in social housing? And yes, I think amongst local authority managers, there's an ideological blockage to doing it. But more than that is, I don't think that they want to long-term maintain the social housing units. And that's why they're very enthusiastic about handing them over to approved housing bodies. So there's a couple of local authorities, I think about 42% of them in the UK, that have their own development companies, who have used their own development companies and essentially got back in to the area of social housing. Key to that is that the development companies have a for-profit motive in terms of they sell on the units at market value in order to be able to supplement the social and affordable. The public-private partnership and what was proposed in the Oscar Traynor Road in O'Devany, and I want to go back to that because I voted for O'Devany, but I also agonised over O'Devany in terms of the deal that was on the table and what was there for us. And there was a lot of to and fro beforehand to come up with the breakdown to go from 20% affordable, and in terms of the legal process had already started with what when we put out the call for tenders to come back for O'Devany. I was never comfortable with the decision and never happy about the decision. And always, it was just one of those things that I was uncomfortable over. But you come and you look at when it came to the Oscar Traynor Road, and I was really happy to see that the majority of councillors decided to vote against the Oscar Traynor Road. Because as was referred to earlier on, you have a situation where public-private partnerships, I think it was Anthony who referred to it, public-private partnerships have gone for, I grew up beside Fatima Mansions, and the public-private partnership there was that the developer built the housing and they gave it to the council for free on the land. That when the crash happened, most of those public-private partnerships failed, but this new one is that we essentially give the land. The developer builds market rents, market value that are out of reach of ordinary people, and that the council also buy back the social and the housing units. And it's not a sustainable system. So what do we do if local authorities and local authority managers and local authority housing managers don't want to get involved in the maintenance of it? Well, I think we could have a national development agency that is both involved in the development of social housing and affordable housing, but also the maintenance of it. We have a very large number of approved housing bodies in this country of various sizes. But I do think that political will is required to actually do a direct state build. And I think there is resistance then at a much lower level amongst local authority managers. So if the minister is serious about it, if he is serious about direct build, he can set up a state development company that will develop and maintain those units if local authorities aren't doing it. And I think you see from some of the figures that they are. I also think Owen's figures last week in relation to the spend on turnkey as opposed to direct builds were really, really interesting. And then we look at what the government has done. And I think there is an ideological positioning, particularly in Fianna Fáil, for affordable to buy home ownership. And that's fine. But the problem is, how does the state support that? And the state supports that through things like the Help to Buy scheme. So the Help to Buy scheme, where you can get 30,000, an analysis done of the Help to Buy scheme by our own parliamentary budget office showed that the majority of people already had a mortgage and that they were the higher end of first-time buyers in terms of the cost of it. So essentially, those schemes that are there to support affordability and home ownership are supporting developers, because if you have a limited number of houses that are coming onto the market, a developer knows that you're getting extra money. They are just adding to the price of it. So in affordable housing, I'm very much convinced of the only way to do it is through the cost rental system and programme. But we have 3 cost rental projects that are currently being used. I would love to see somewhere like Oscar Traynor be used for a cost rental as well. But in the budget, there was only 400 affordable units available for cost rental. So the breakdown in the affordable rental package, 110 million, 75 of that was to afford an affordable purchase scheme, and 35 million of that was to go towards cost rental. And I just want to finalise and finish up on a point, because I think maybe there's been an oversimplification of how things can happen and do. But one of the big failings of local authorities are they give money to local authorities, sorry, not local authorities, the Department of Housing. They give money to build, but they don't give money for any of the other supportive services around it. And so it comes to parks, pitches, community centres. Local authorities are left with a big gaping hole and gap when it comes to that. And they have no other way of getting money, so they feel like they are obliged to trade land and dispose of land. And that's a key driver in terms of how some of the local authorities manage the land that they have. I think we need to have a fund for community supports to be there in community infrastructure, because we're not just building housing. We're meant to build housing for the long term, and we're also meant to build communities. And I think one of the great things, Orla referred to how people perceived public housing to be in the past. That was because of a lack of investment in communities and other problems that are associated with it. You cannot build public housing without having support services and community infrastructure. You can't build any housing without having community infrastructure to back it up. And there's a giant failing and hole in the Department of Housing not making money available for that for large scale projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and very, very detailed as well. And particularly on that whole issue, which I think we have to come back to, is the role of the local authorities and whether they're capable, whether they're resourced to build on the scale that we require, that 20,000 a year. And indeed, are there other ways of doing it? What's other agencies could help to do that? We'll come back to those questions afterwards. The third speaker is Cian O'Callaghan, spokesperson on housing, planning and local government for the Social Democrats and TD for Dublin Bay North. Cian, you're welcome.
Thanks very much, Frank, and thanks to the other speakers and to Raised Roof for organising this. I just firstly want to say that I agree strongly with the point Jessica was making on the first panel, that, you know, housing, we are where we are now effectively because housing has been commodified, turned into a financial asset, and it's not looked at in terms of people's right to have a home, and then we need to get back to that. And I also want to agree with the points made by, you know, Mel and Orla and others that, you know, this is solvable. It can be done. What I want to do is outline 5 things that I think could be done pretty much straight away, and then 5 things that can be done quickly enough but take a bit more time. But just firstly, I want to talk about when I was a councillor in Fingal during my first term. I made comments to my local newspaper about an unfinished housing estate in the area, and I described it as an unfinished housing estate. I described it as an unfinished housing estate. The developer of the housing estate took great offence at me using these words, rang me up, gave out to me, demanded that I come and meet him at the unfinished housing estate. So I did that, and he spent about an hour or two talking me through his entire record in the area, everything he'd done. He was very proud of it and all the rest. But what was very interesting that is during that time, he explained to me a number of things that a lot of us, I think, would assume that's happening at the moment, and he confirmed all of it. So he told me that he controlled all of the development land in the entire area, had a total monopoly on it. He explained that he controlled all of the new homes in the area and was releasing them one by one onto the market to keep prices high. He told me he controlled all of the rental properties in the area, and again was releasing them, even though he had hundreds of them, was releasing them one by one to keep the rents high. And he was just explaining what I think a lot of us know. He was explaining the business model that he had and what, you know, made sense for him as a developer to do. And you've developers doing that, keeping prices artificially high because everything we've designed facilitates that at a political level. That's what needs to be unpicked. So just in terms of 5 things I would do straight away is in terms of homelessness, I'd, end the use of private for-profit providers of emergency accommodation. There's been a huge growth in those. Those kind of private hostels don't have support workers to support people who are homeless. When we've seen with some of them, they've been evicting people for very minor breaches of rules and regulations, ending up with people sleeping rough. I'd end the favourable tax treatment and loopholes for institutional investors, cuckoo funds and REITs, which is facilitating this kind of mass buy-up of new apartments and the kind of build-to-rent model. And in fact, I think we should go a step further than that, and under planning, as they've done in some countries, is prohibit mass sale of new builds to one institutional investor. And that would take pressure away from pushing land prices up and increasing rent and housing costs. I'd introduce a land hoarding tax to prevent developers sitting on valuable land banks and pushing up the price of housing that way. Introduce protections for renters, nationwide ban on rent increases, banning evictions at least till the pandemic's over, and then debt and resolution mediation schemes for people falling behind in rent. And I'd end the 4-stage approval process of social housing by local authorities, which is heavily bureaucratic, and it is part of the problem in terms of social housing delivery, the kind of hoops and the time that it takes for local authorities to get through the process when they want to build social housing. I've seen that directly myself. In terms of other measures that could be done relatively quickly, in terms of housing, homelessness, I think we need to, as Owen Bryn was saying, housing first. We should be, as our immediate target, we should be providing a long-term secure tenancy for every homeless person who's been identified that has a higher support need, be it people who've been sleeping rough or who've been in and out of emergency accommodation over a number of years. Agree with having a referendum on the right to housing. I think that's important. I think in terms of renters, we need to eliminate most grounds for eviction, as is the case in a lot of other countries where the only grounds for eviction might be antisocial behaviour or failure to pay rent. And with that, you can't evict people into homelessness. I think land is a key part of this. And Orla and Mel are right in terms of there is a lot of land there in public ownership at the moment, but we need to continue to build up public land banks and make sure that that kind of supply of land for development isn't in the hands of developers. And that includes stronger CPO powers, effectively implementing the Kenny report to make land and housing more affordable. And then in terms of cost rental, affordable purchase, social homes, we need to very much go for the state-led delivery on that. Owen makes an interesting point there that we can't yet, in terms of acquisitions and turnkeys, we can't end that, or end that overnight. And there's certainly circumstances where you do need to do that, including when there's particular needs, in terms of getting maybe larger family homes. If you don't have them coming through your stream, or some single units. But overall, we should be moving away from that private sector development. So I'll leave it there and look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Kate. That was very tight, very interesting. And I think, again, it keeps coming back to this: how do we get through all those obstacles to actually building the state building land? Finally, Richard Boyd Barrett, TD for People Before Profit in Dún Laoghaire and spokesman on housing, planning and local government. I'm always fascinated by that title because I can never remember where the planning comes in. In fact, I don't know where the housing comes in. But Richard, you're welcome.
Hey, Frank. Thanks a million, and well done to Raise the Roof for organising the event. And all the contributions have been fantastic. And I think we're largely, if not completely, all singing off the same hymn sheet. And in a way, I think probably just the questions and the debate rather than the speeches are probably the more important thing at this point, because I think we've covered a lot of the ground in terms of what we think needs to be done. And, really, what needs to be done to address the, shocking, obscene and unnecessary housing and homelessness crisis that we are facing and have been facing for, a decade, effectively. Well, indeed, it's been building up for probably a couple of decades, but has reached absolute extreme crisis point in the last few years. What needs to be done to address that was captured in the motion that, Raise the Roof put forward, and that got passed in the Dáil in the under the last government. And I think we all are pretty much on the same hymn sheet in that, i.e. we need to start to once again build on scale public housing on public land, because the market has proven completely incapable of delivering the housing that we need at a price, rent or purchase price, that is affordable to the vast majority of people. Dún Laoghaire is a kind of weather vane of the future in this regard, because house prices and rents have always been high there, but it points the way where everybody else tends to follow in terms of the dysfunctionality of a market that is driven by profit. So currently, you are talking about, you won't get a 2-bedroom apartment for less than €2,000 a month in Dún Laoghaire, right? That's €24,000 is required in order to rent a house and put a roof over your head. Totally unaffordable. You know, that is more than a lot of workers get in after-tax income. And it is, you know, what? I don't know what percentage, but it is a massive percentage of the average income in reality. It's about 70 to 80% of average after-tax income for working people in this country. It is off the charts. Average house prices in Dún Laoghaire Rathdown are over €500,000. Completely, you know, unaffordable for ordinary people. So that is the level of dysfunctionality and failure. And while, you know, people might say Dún Laoghaire is an affluent area, the truth is there's huge numbers of working people in South Dublin on very average and low incomes, and you know, there's just nothing for them. So it's a dire situation. And yes, it could be solved like that. And this is true everywhere. I mean, I just cite my own area because I'm so familiar with it. The housing situation in our area could be solved with two development sites, Cherrywood and Shangana Castle site, what used to be the former Shangana prison, and Cherrywood. Cherrywood is zoned for 8,000 units and has just been sitting there for, I think it's about 15 years now. Passed from one developer to another, currently in the hands of Hines, a big international property investment gang. And they just sat on it. And before that, you had a series of other Celtic Tiger developers. And it has just sat there. They're beginning to develop it, but they do it at their pace. They're starting with the town centre, building hotels and build-to-rent apartments, which are going to cost about 400,000 a unit, which, you know, who can afford that? But they will drip feed and have them. They just sat on the site, and insofar as they develop it, they will drip feed it, or indeed just flip the land, as has been done on some of the parcels of land up there, to other developers to make money out of it. When that land was in NAMA's hands for a brief period, and could have been built out as public housing at actual, you know, a level that is affordable to ordinary people. So to me, it's as simple as that. And similarly, the Shangana site, which was handed over 16 years ago from the Department of Justice to Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council, earmarked for social housing because of local campaigning and political campaigning, and it has just sat there for 16 years. With talk about putting public and affordable housing, but it hasn't happened because of the ideological insistence of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil governments that you had to, in some shape or form, involve private finance in its development. And I find it almost laughable. I mean, the other day when we were debating with Darragh O'Brien, the housing minister, about Oscar Traynor and what was going to happen now that Dublin city councillors had very correctly said they weren't going to accept the privatisation of that site, he said, oh, of course we want to develop it, but now let's not be ideological about it. Let's be practical and realistic. So the narrative is the left, who want to build public housing and public land, are ideological and impractical, but the government, who insist on the involvement of private finance, private developers and so on, they're the practical people. Their approach is practical. But then you look at the reality. It's not practical at all. When you look at Shangana and you look at Cherrywood, it's not practical. It is actually driven by ideology, and the ideology which says we have to make profit out of these sites, otherwise nothing will be done there. And that's why a site like Shangana Castle sits there for 16 years, because of their absolute insistence that it cannot be developed unless somebody can make a profit out of it. And similarly with Cherrywood, which will be the biggest residential development in the state, and could have delivered 8,000 housing units years ago, but it isn't, because it's in the hands of private developers driven by profit, and they have absolutely no interest whatsoever in delivering housing at affordable levels. So, you know, I think we all know this stuff, but the question is, you know, what can we do to give effect to the demands of build public housing on public land, to stop evictions, to control rents, to stop land hoarding and speculation, to get hold of the empty properties, and to establish the right to housing as a basic human right in this country? What can we do? And I think it is a political fight. It's a political fight against the parties that are absolutely committed, primarily the two major parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who are absolutely wedded and committed to the property interests and the for-profit interests that get rich through essentially creating a shortage of housing. You know, there is a group of people, the wealthy in Irish society, who have a vested interest in not solving the crisis, in ensuring there's a shortage, because they make money. So we are in a political fight against them. And really the question for us is, how do we mobilize the forces that are capable of actually pushing them out of the way and doing what everybody knows needs to be done? And I do think, I'll just finish on this, I do think that the election showed that we now have won, if you like, the battle of ideas in that regard, because their approach has failed so catastrophically, you know, evidenced in 2008, evidenced in the housing crisis that came afterwards. And I think that played a huge part, the crisis that sort of came out of that failure has played a huge part, as Owen O'Brien said earlier on, in the outcome of the general election. So I think we have won the battle of ideas with the majority of people about what needs to be done to solve the housing crisis. But we haven't yet, unfortunately, translated that into, you know, a sufficiently powerful political and social movement to drive the people who are wedded to the profit approach to housing out of power. And I think that's the challenge that confronts us.
Okay, Richard, I think that's a good summary of where the challenge lies. Just go back to something that Orla Hegarty said in the last session, which is that, and indeed Mel Reynolds, and the figures were there to back them up. The land is there. The state can afford to borrow the money at zero interest. The question is, where is the willingness and what is the vehicle to build? And I think that really is still a fundamental question. You mentioned, Richard, the fact that the Raise the Roof motion was carried back in October 18, I think, and it contains all of those proposals for building on public land and doubling the investment required. Fianna Fáil actually supported the motion, if you remember, when they were in opposition. I think it's worth, let's take it from there rather than going back over the issues. As I was saying, Orla suggested that actually cut out the ideology. Actually, the facts are on the ground. Let's just build. And I think people take the point that ideologically Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and indeed others are tied to an agenda of private market delivery. We have a question here, for instance, as to whether it's possible to do something that Cian suggested, to discourage vulture funds out of the buy-to-rent market. Does anybody want to take that up? Perhaps, Cian, seeing as you mentioned that, you could answer that question very quickly. Answers need to be nearly yes or no.
Well, yes, but the private vulture funds effectively pay no tax, and that's what's happening. It's completely distorting the delivery of housing. So they're being encouraged in on the most favourable terms. Tax treatment should stop straight away. But then, as I said, you could go further than that and actually outright ban purchase of large amount of homes by institutional investors, which I think there's a very strong case for doing as well. We should be doing that also.
Okay, I want to put another question. Is it the nature of funding part of the problem? For instance, local authorities need to use up central government monies before the end of the year, lack of ring fencing of such funds in some cases. Rebecca, you touched on this issue. Perhaps you could deal with that question.
I think it's the tightness of the funding streams as well for very specific things. So I think that's a problem. And I just want to touch on, there's a comment there that somebody said that I had suggested to outsource the maintenance. I didn't suggest that. I think the state needs to do the long-term maintenance of its housing stock. What I suggested is, because local authorities haven't been willing to do it, or they have ease themselves out of it. And I think it's partially because they don't want to be involved in the long-term maintenance of the stock. I think we need another state agency that will potentially do that. And I do think it's a problem with the funding streams that are there. They're very focused. So you have the social housing funding stream, then you have the site services fund. There's nothing for infrastructure. And so I think it's the tightness of them. And as Keane said, and I think Owen said it as well, the 4-stage process is ridiculous. Like I've been involved in some housing developments or regeneration projects where local authorities get really detailedly involved in the design, or you might agree one thing and then next thing you hear, well, the department aren't happy with that. So I think that's a problem, is that they're how hands-on sometimes they are from a somewhat ideological perspective to do it. So that's another big problem, is the dysfunction of the department.
Well, one of the reasons that the trade union movement obviously is so involved in Raise the Roof, and indeed helped to initiate it, is because of and it was mentioned again in the previous session, thousands of people potentially could be involved in construction. Many of those are obviously members of trade unions. And in the case of SIPTU, we get responses all the time from our members in local authorities that, one, the management and the department have stripped the local authorities of the skill base that was there. And indeed, when you mention the word maintenance, I suspect that local authorities, as you've said, don't want to have the problem of maintaining housing, and have got rid of the people and the skills that they used to have. And I actually think it's a huge problem. It's not an ideological problem that local authority management and the managers association, that very secretive group, I believe, with some exceptions that Mel pointed to, I think earlier on, do not want to have anything to do with the building or maintenance of public housing. That leads to a second question. People talk about a possible agency that could take this on board to do it on a national scale. And that relates, of course, to what they have done. The previous governments set up a land development agency, ostensibly to do this work. But in my view, and indeed the view of others, I think it actually isn't designed to do that at all. Owen, do you want to take?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Frank. I mean, look, my strong view is local government will do what central government legislates and funds to do. And therefore, the central problem of under delivery of social and affordable housing or maintenance is that central government, since the early 1990s, have asset stripped our local authorities. Now, that doesn't mean some aren't good and some aren't bad, but if we're serious about delivering the volume of public housing we need, local authorities have to be given the capital budgets. It needs to be multi-annual. The bureaucracy of the department needs to be stripped away, and the staff need to be put there to deliver those homes. And then central government's job is to oversee that and ensure it happens properly. I'm very, very concerned about the Land Development Agency. It currently sits on a non-statutory footing. Darragh O'Brien has produced a revised general scheme of the legislation which he wants to underpin it. And this is more of the same complicated, overly centralised and unduly involving private finance and private developers in public housing. So if you take Shangana Castle, which Richard rightly pointed out, this is now a development that Dún Laoghaire County Council are doing in conjunction with the Land Development Agency. Because of the way the LDA are financed, the cost that the affordable rental tenants will be paying there will be €1,300 a month. If you did that as a fully public scheme by a local authority, your entry level rents would be €800 a month for the very same apartment. Likewise, the LDA is going to become, if the government gets its way, the lead organisation in the delivery of cost rental. So we're going to split off affordable rental accommodation from subsidised social rental accommodation, an absolutely preposterous idea that's just going to make things much more difficult. So probably the biggest battle we're going to face in the Oireachtas over the next 6 to 8 months is the Land Development Agency legislation. Government want this to deliver 120,000 homes. And in fact, on many of the developments they're looking at, the Dundrum Central Mental Hospital site, currently owned by the OPW, we're probably going to see a deal not unlike Oscar Traynor, where 50% plus of the properties there could be sold on the open market at unaffordable open market prices. But even the so-called affordables could be well beyond the reach of regular working people. So, I mean, I know some of the other parties on the panel have a different proposition around a land agency and a central delivery agency, and those are different to the LDA. but people need to be very clear. The LDA, as it's currently constituted, is a really, really bad set of propositions, and certainly Raise the Roof and those of us who have the political responsibility to deal with the legislation need to and will be working closely together to fight this, because it's not the solution to the crisis that everybody's outlined here today.
Okay, there's a particular question here from Alan Brady, barrister and adjunct law lecturer, TCD, Trinity College. Can a referendum on constitutional right to housing generate political capital for legislative and policy change? Many positive changes are currently constitutionally possible, but are not happening. If we get a right to housing in the Constitution, will that be a stimulus for further positive action? Richard, you touched on this in your final comments. Do you want to give us a response?
Yeah, I think without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, to force the entire country, well, you wouldn't be forcing them. I think the country would welcome a national debate that would inevitably result from having a referendum around the issue of housing. I think would be hugely valuable in driving the issue back to the top of the political agenda. And it's not hard in a way to put it to the top of the agenda of ordinary people, because it is just the most basic pressing need for huge numbers of people. And at the moment, the system is singularly capable of delivering for huge numbers of people on that need. So yes, I think it would be enormous, and not just in, as the questioner is suggesting, not just in terms of what it would do constitutionally or legally, but in forcing the entire debate about how do you resolve the housing crisis, what is the solution to deliver affordable housing, and all of the attendant issues, but also to remove the excuses. I mean, at this point, it's difficult to know what is the constitutional position around private property, because it's used as such an excuse. We couldn't have rent controls, we couldn't have a ban on evictions, then all of a sudden we had them. The things that were impossible became possible. But even now, the government are still using as an excuse. So they're saying, oh, yes, we were able to be in an eviction ban and a rent increase ban, but only in level 5. And as soon as we go to level 3, the evictions are on again and rent increases can go flying up, because we're constitutionally bound that must be the case. I mean, it's probably legally and constitutionally nonsense, but I think we need to take that ball away from this government and any other government, remove those excuses, clarify the legal situation in order to be able to take the sort of measures that we all agree on rent controls, compulsory purchase of empty buildings, dealing with land speculation, all of those things that are sometimes hidden behind the private property and constitutional provisions.
I think some people did suggest that, a right to housing is something that everybody accepts. But the problem is, even if you get it into the Constitution, does that mean we're going to have housing for everybody in the morning? No, it's not. But I think Raise the Roof certainly, and the trade union movement have argued as well that it is an important way of opening up those issues. And of course, COVID has shown what's possible in another world. I mean, we didn't have wage subsidies, we didn't have pandemic unemployment payments, we didn't have the scale of supports, which, as you said, Richard, were deemed impossible or even unconstitutional a couple of years ago. I want to ask a specific question here on behalf of one listener or one viewer. What is the panel's view on implementing the recommendations of the expert group on traveller accommodation to take responsibility out of the hands of local authorities after decades of failure and inaction? Owen, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, so this is a really important report, and in fact, it has quite a number of recommendations. It should have been implemented last year in full. Just to be clear, the recommendation isn't that you take responsibility away from local authorities. What it is because of the failure of local authorities to fully implement their legally binding traveller accommodation programs and their failure to spend the money for a temporary period of time, some of those powers would be taken away from elected members. And the managers and then a body above the managers, as yet to be decided, because that government hasn't settled on that, would force implementation. I have to say, while other aspects of our housing crisis will take time to resolve, the speed with which political will at central government level could address the absolutely appalling 19th century accommodation conditions on our traveller accommodation sites could be dealt with very, very quickly. And my worry is, while the previous Minister of State who had responsibility for this, I have to give him credit, he was serious about it. I don't think his party was, but he was. I'm not convinced the current Minister for State is. And therefore, I think, again, those of us who are members of the Housing Committee, there are 3 of us here, but also those of us in Raise the Roof, including Rich and others, we have to make the full implementation of this report an absolute priority. That's going to require some legislation, some government regulations, and some other bits and pieces from the department. But it's kind of slipped off the agenda. And just to say, this year, local authorities are spending even less of an increased budget when they could have actually been spending far more of it, even to make the sites that we have less risky in terms of COVID-19, to go back to Orla's point. So this is a big issue for us, and we shouldn't lose sight of it.
Okay, we're actually coming close to the end. I want to do a couple of things. One, Raise the Roof is going to take up, as something, again, you suggested, Owen, a series of webinars over the coming months, including listening to the voices from the edge, the people on the margins, as you said, in relation to direct provision, people with disabilities and travellers, as you just mentioned. And that's something we intend to do. We also want to try and map out what Raise the Roof should be doing, and any suggestions will be welcome. We won't have time to get into that today, but I think flowing from this conversation, it would be good for all of those who participated and attended or listened or viewed or may view afterwards, because we are going to record this, we have been recording it, to send in your suggestions. Clearly, we're not going to be mobilising on the streets anytime soon, given the COVID crisis, but hopefully that will be allayed in sometime by the spring or early summer of next year. And crucially, of course, the problem is we have a government that said it wanted to do all these things, and the startling figures from Mel Reynolds and Orla about actual house bills are shocking. And indeed, the figures showing that it actually is affordable on public land to build a house for 250,000. People will be stunned by that. I want to ask finally Jessica Freed, who opened this debate this morning, and who hasn't been involved in any of these Raise the Roof discussions up to now. If she's still there, Jessica, do you want to say a few words as to what you picked up from this session or both sessions?
Well, thanks, Frank. Well, I'm hugely encouraged by what I've heard. Almost everything that I didn't get a chance to say in the beginning has been touched on by every single speaker that's followed me. So I'm delighted with that. And I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. Without a public consciousness raising campaign alongside that can clearly communicate all these solutions and challenge all these excuses and all the misperceptions around it, it's the only thing that's going to be effective. Anything you do is only going to be half as effective, because as somebody said, you know, the will is kind of there. People are on, since the last election, people are on board with housing. It was the #1 issue, but really you have to build on that. You have to grab people while they're open to it. And that's what you have to do. So I think Raise the Roof is brilliant because it's bringing a trade union-led movement. It's fantastic. And it's bringing so many people together, experts, politicians, the trade unions, people on the ground and homeless services, all the rest of it. And it's a great facility for getting that message out there in a coherent way and a consistent way to the public.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica. And listen, thank you very much to all of the participants this morning, our panelists. I won't go through all of the names, and in particular to the more than 100, and I don't know what the figure is, but it's gone over 150 now who stayed and listened. And I assure you, we will be convening our own Raise the Roof and meetings over the next couple of weeks to plan out the new year. And in the meantime, I wish everybody well, and please send in we will be putting the questions, those that we didn't get to, although we tried to cover what was in the questions in the responses. And I think most of the speakers covered most of the areas that were asked about. Again, thank you very much and good luck. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank.